Chinese has a reputation for being hard to learn, and it can be even harder if you take a course that is above your level. But why would you do that? What are the potential pros and cons of deliberately seeking out a learning environment where just keeping your head above water will be hard? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about courses that are hard, or even too hard maybe. And to be clear here, I mean courses that are difficult beyond Chinese itself being difficult to learn. Of course, any course is hard, you need to invest time and energy to learn, and that is nothing strange. But here I'm talking about courses that are designed for people whose Chinese is better than yours, and where there is a risk of failing the course unless you invest significantly more time than the other students. The default approach is, of course, to look for courses that are on your level and which are designed for students like you. I mean, they are designed like that for a reason, so if you are in the target group, it's likely that the course will benefit you the most. There are situations when harder courses can actually benefit you, though, and that's what we're going to talk about today. To start with, I would like to share a story of the first time I tried this, and this was back in 2009. And yes, I know that was a very long time ago, but back then I had studied Chinese for a little more than a year and I had just switched universities because the previous one I studied at really didn't offer that many Chinese courses and I needed to find something that was more suitable for my situation. After going to class for 2 weeks or so, I realized though that this new school, while it had more different courses for different levels, it really had the same problem, and that was that most people who studied there were actually busy with other things. They were teaching English, working with other things, and so on, and learning Chinese for a few hours. Not on the side, really, they were quite serious, many of them, but they still had other commitments that stopped them from really investing all their time into learning Chinese. And I was lucky enough to have a scholarship back then, so I wanted to maximize the amount of Chinese I learned and I wanted to get the most out of these courses. So I discussed the situation with the responsible teachers at the language center, and they allowed me to try 2 different courses. One that was a little bit harder, maybe they were a month or 2 ahead of the course I was currently in, and one that was much harder, maybe as much as a year or more ahead. So I tried both out and I thought about the situation and fairly quickly realized that if I took the slightly harder course, I would encounter the same problem maybe a month or a few weeks from now. So it wouldn't really make a difference. So I decided to try to go to the difficult class and see if I were able to survive, figuring that if I didn't survive, at least I would learn a lot along the way. And for those of you who have studied in Taiwan and have a decent grasp of textbooks used there, I had just finished Practical Audiovisual Chinese Book 3 and jumped straight into the middle of Book 5, so essentially skipping 1.5 textbook, along with the exposure and experience that come with that. The new course also used a book called Media Chinese, which uses authentic newspaper articles, which was way above my level at the time. After talking through the situation with the responsible teachers, I figured that this was something that I could do, but that it would be very difficult and require an awful lot of extra time. Since this was something I actually wanted to do, I wanted a challenge so that I was sure that I invested as much time as possible into learning, I thought that this sounded like an interesting challenge, so I dove straight in. To make a long story short, I of course wasn't able to catch up with my classmates. They had studied Chinese much longer than me and their Chinese was much, much better. But I was able to survive the course. I also learned an awful lot, and I also think that I learned much more than I would have if I had stayed in that other, easier course. But let's back up a bit. Why am I doing this in the first place? Is this really a good idea? And when should you consider doing something like this? Well, let's look at some of the benefits first. And the first one is that the learning environment in itself is much more conducive to learning. And a big reason for that is that your classmates' Chinese is much better, which means there is more Chinese flying around in the classroom, and you are constantly surrounded by people who are better than you, and if you can do that with a positive attitude and without burning out, that is usually a good thing when learning anything, not just Chinese. It's worth pointing out here that if you don't do this properly, you might actually encroach on their learning and drag them down because you don't do what you're supposed to do, or you take up too much time asking questions you shouldn't ask, or things like that. So you do need to be respectful and you need to be considerate about other people's learning experience as well. But I am convinced that you can do this in a way that doesn't negatively impact other people's learning. The second benefit of enrolling in a difficult course is that the minimum effort required is very high. I think this is maybe one of the biggest advantages, especially if you like challenges. For example, I feel that if I have a challenge, I need to do something to even survive in this kind of environment, I will invest an awful lot of time and energy that I maybe wouldn't have invested if I didn't have to. Of course, I was very motivated to learn Chinese at the time, and I'm sure I would have learned a lot of Chinese outside class, but I still spent some 15 to 20 hours in a classroom every week. And if that time wouldn't have been very useful because it was maybe too easy or because it was designed for people who didn't study as much as I did, then I definitely would have learned less and relaxed a little bit more. The third benefit is related to the first one, and it's about the amount of Chinese that you hear. Because if you are taking low-level courses, and this will depend slightly on where you are studying and under what circumstances, but it's likely that there will be a lot more English in a course at a lower level compared to at a higher level. So essentially you will encounter more Chinese the more advanced the course is. And this is not just true when it comes to English or other languages, it's also true that more Chinese in general is spoken in a classroom that is more advanced because people, speak quickly with longer sentences and there's more content to cover and so on. So in essence, this is a way to expose yourself to much more Chinese and increase the minimum requirements a lot so that you will be able to invest more time and energy into learning. Naturally, taking a course that isn't designed for you also has downsides, which is why most people shouldn't do this most of the time. This is an exception. Let's look at a few disadvantages. So the first one is that it could leave huge gaps in your knowledge. And this is quite obvious in my case. I skipped an entire textbook. And of course, not everything in a textbook is useful, but you could argue that most of that content was actually useful, and that was something that I should have learned first. Well, I did pick up most of the vocabulary by studying the more advanced textbooks and encountering these words naturally, but I also spent a lot of time after this semester going through the old textbooks to see what I had missed, and of course I had missed a lot. On a similar note, it's also easy to neglect basic skills, such as character knowledge or pronunciation. Because your classmates are more advanced than you, there's not going to be too much support in class for fixing basic mistakes that maybe someone in an easier class would actually have focused on. So you're much more on your own when it comes to these, and you definitely should not count on your teacher helping you out here. You shouldn't even count on that in a normal course, but even less so if the course is more advanced than you are prepared for. This essentially means that you are on your own when it comes to fixing basic mistakes, and you really need to take this seriously because if you don't, you might get the idea that your Chinese is getting better and better, but you might still have fundamental issues with basic things such as tones or how characters work or something like that, things that would immensely benefit your Chinese if you spent more time. But since you are in this advanced course, you don't have time to do it, and so you neglect it. Next up, taking a difficult course is difficult. It can be frustrating and exhausting. And then maybe it doesn't matter how motivated you are if you have to study day in and day out, and when you go to class you still feel that you're so much behind, you don't understand what's going on, and that may make you feel worse and worse, and if it goes really badly, you might even decide to quit or do something else instead. This is, of course, a pity, because learning languages has the potential to be very interesting and enjoyable, and if you turn it into a chore and something you have to do to just stay afloat, well, then maybe it isn't worth it. So instead of seeking out a course that is too difficult for you, just focus on things that are on your level. Read and listen as much as possible, and then gradually improve your Chinese. That is perfectly fine. In fact, I would argue that most people learning Chinese in various institutions around the world today tend to spend too much time on text and audio that is too hard for them, and that they should really focus more on extensive listening and reading. So what I'm suggesting here, if you are taking a course that is too hard for you, you are essentially going to make everything very intensive indeed, and that means that there might not be enough time for you to do this type of extensive listening and reading. Like I said earlier though, I have sought out courses that are too difficult for me several times, not just once, and I generally tend to think that this has had a very positive impact on my learning. There are a few things you really need if you want to attempt something like this though, and hope to get something out of it. And the first one is time. You need to make sure that you have the time available. You need to be able to spend twice, 3 times, 4 times as much as is actually intended by the people who design the course. So if a normal student is meant to spend 5 hours, you should definitely be prepared to spend 10 hours a day, or maybe even more. And of course, this will depend on how difficult the course is. I mean, there's no guarantee that you will be able to make it at all if it's very difficult, and if it's just a little bit difficult, well, maybe you just need a few extra hours, not just twice or 3 times as many. And I do, of course, realize that it is a privilege to have that amount of time to invest into something like language learning. Like I said before, I was on a scholarship when I did this, and I was very lucky to have an opportunity to do nothing else. And if I would have had to work at the same time, obviously a project like this wouldn't be feasible. The second thing you need is a strong motivation to learn, and you need to be able to count on this lasting for the entire semester. If you feel eager to get started and you don't know that this is something that will last, you shouldn't just launch yourself into a project like this. You need to be able to count on it lasting for a long time so it can carry you through a whole semester at least. And the reason is quite simple. You will invest a lot of time into something that won't really show any results to begin with. You will feel roughly as bad the first lesson as you do the 5th lesson and maybe even the 25th lesson. But then after a month or maybe 2, you will start maybe feeling that you are more in control of what's going on, you can follow what's going on in class, and so on. But you need a strong motivation to take you through that dark period before you see the light at the end of the tunnel. If you don't feel up to struggling a lot without seeing much sign of progress, then you shouldn't do this. Finally, you also need support. To begin with, you need the support of your teacher and other people to maybe even allow you to do this, so it's not guaranteed that you will be able to do it just because you want to. And in addition to this, you also need the support of your teacher because he or she will be able to share with you learning materials in advance so you can preview properly and so on, and just generally be understanding that you will be behind the other students. You probably also need external support of some kind, maybe a tutor, maybe a native speaker friend, or a language exchange partner, or someone who can help you sort out all those problems you don't have time to deal with in class. Because you can't ask your teacher everything, because, well, they might be nice enough to allow you into their class, but they have other students. They cannot spend more than your fair share of time helping you out with your questions. Finally, don't forget about moral support. It can be great to have friends and family cheering you on, even if they are not learning Chinese themselves. I hope this makes it clear why seeking out a course that is too difficult for you is a bad idea for most people most of the time. Because even if you do have time, motivation, and support, and you really want to do this, there are still severe downsides to focusing on content that is too difficult. And most of the time, you're simply better off focusing on content on your level. This will allow you to make steady progress and also make it more likely that you enjoy the journey. And if ramping up the difficulty means that you will not have time to engage with the culture or to get to know native speakers or just enjoy your stay in a Chinese-speaking environment, then it's probably not worth it. However, if you do have the time, energy, and support that it takes to succeed in a course that is too hard for you, I also think that it can bring significant benefits. In this week's episode, I haven't talked too much about how to survive in a course that is too hard for you, and indeed that's something I will do in an upcoming episode discussing what you should do beyond investing more time and effort, of course. Where should you spend that time? How can you make sure that your effort isn't wasted? How do you stay focused and positive, even when everything feels impossible? Stay tuned to find out. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.